Good morning. I'm going to try and cheat for a few minutes by showing you a video that myself and a few colleagues made in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. Allegedly, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so you're going to see some pictures now, hopefully, if this works. Just bear with me while I pull it up. It deals with the situation in Ukraine, specifically concerning issues such as the information war, also the situation of refugees, and finally with Crimea. So, bear with me 1 minute, and hopefully I can show it to you. Just a little bit about it. What we were doing in Ukraine was we were trying to find some evidence of the narrative by the Russian authorities of what's happening there. And this video is about the city of Lviv, which is in the west of Ukraine, has a lot of Ukrainian language speakers, and is also home to, or was home to, Stepan Bandera, which, as you may be aware, is portrayed as a kind of fascist emblem in Ukraine. If this doesn't work, don't worry, I'll move on to describe it. There it is. Okay. It should also have subtitles, so hopefully. Technology is not going to help us today. All right. Well, I will tell you verbally then what the issue is. Basically, NATO TV, and if this starts, I'll just stop. NATO TV went to Kiev and Lviv a couple of weeks ago. The idea was to get some information about, as I say, some of the areas that have been discussed on a regular basis in the media. We spoke to people from the OSCE, who are obviously supposed to be charged with monitoring the border. We spoke to NGOs, businessmen, public officials, and refugees. One of the ideas was to see if there was any facts that could back up some of the Russian narrative. Unfortunately, the video would have told you this, but and you're welcome to have a look at it in your own time on YouTube. But what we did was we talked to people in Lviv about what their reaction has been to the influx of people coming to the west from the east. Now, there are more or less 8,000 people in the region of Lviv who've come to live there since the beginning of the war. And the area of Lviv had obviously not foreseen A, war, like many of us, or B, that there would be people arriving in the territory. So there was no budget, there was no infrastructure, there was no provisions made for these people. So what happened to them? Well, they arrived and they were basically treated as well as you could expect. What they've been offered is free accommodation by many Ukrainians who have actually gone online looking, in many cases, as I say, it comes out in the video, gone online looking to help people. So this isn't the case of them arriving in the house and then being rather annoyed that they're living there. Actually looking to help people. Helping with looking for jobs, because some of these people are resettling in the West. Help with school for those who have children, and others. What we found was that this wasn't a problem at all, and that the Russian-speaking element of these people who were arriving was not a problem either. Although Ukrainian is the main language in the West, Russian is widely spoken. So, not scientific at all, obviously. It was just us spending a day in Lviv and talking to people. We did go to the university area because we thought, well, A, Bandera went to this university, B, students are often the most radicalized people, C, they tend to speak their mind a a lot. We spoke to several students, and all of them, without fail, talked about how they or their families had been helping refugees. How does this relate to the information war? Well, the information war likes to portray Ukraine as a country that has been overtaken by a coup, that is run by a junta, where fascism is popular, and where Russian speakers are persecuted. A lot of those were the kind of things we were putting up to the test in Ukraine, and we generally found that there wasn't a basis, in fact, to any of them. This is part of a campaign by Russia. It was mentioned earlier that about 300 million is dedicated to Russian propaganda, Russian communications. The figure's actually much higher than that. Some people reckon it could be around $1 billion after increases have been proposed this year. We visited Ukraine today, which is the counterpart to Russia today. It's basically run on a shoestring. Its budget is about 15 million. That's compared to about $1 billion that's being pumped into the Russian messaging. The activities of Russia in the communication area are increasing. They've just launched a new news agency called Soyuz to put the Russian perspective on events. Russia today is about to launch a German language version for obvious reasons. And indeed, there is a proposal that a Russian Wikipedia project be started soon. If you look at Russia today, you'll also see that there are a number of experts that are rolled out, which most of us have never heard of. And with nearly all of the contents that we, NATO, put online, there is instantly a reaction by tens, if not hundreds, of trolls, which you would have seen with this as well, basically talking about propaganda and the usual Russian movements. In other words, there's a communications army. This isn't a random campaign. There is a set of people who are dedicated to this. And it spreads beyond Ukraine as well. Just yesterday, President Putin was talking about NATO destabilizing the Baltics. So you can see how turning the truth on its head is one of the favoured techniques of the Russian regime, and echoing something we've heard before, which is the bigger the lie, the better. To be honest with you, when I see these claims, it reminds me of a child with chocolate around his mouth. You ask the child, have you been eating chocolate? And the child says no. And the evidence is there that that's not true, but the child continues saying no. This is basically what we're dealing with Russian communications at the moment. I was talking to an American friend about this, and he said it reminded him of an American phrase where basically, you can wrestle with a pig. Get down and dirty with the pig to try to fight what's happening. But after a while, you realise that the pig is enjoying himself. And that's basically what we've got to avoid doing. We have to stick to what's really happening rather than go down a propaganda route, which is what Russia is doing. Just two other areas I'd like to tell you about from our trip to Ukraine. One concerns refugees, which I've touched on already, and the other concerns Crimea. Refugees, or to call them correctly, internally displaced people, the number of them in Ukraine now, these Ukrainians living in Ukraine, but the wrong part of Ukraine because they've been forced out of there because of either war or persecution, the numbers are reaching around 500,000, which I would contend would be a challenge to any country. But this is a country that has had its infrastructure, its services, its resources hugely weakened by the corruption of the previous regime. So what happens? Who steps into the gap to help these people? It's been volunteers. The volunteer reaction of Ukrainians was frankly amazing. Let me just give you 3 examples. The first is supplies and equipment to those fighting in the east. I was told by somebody in the army that when the conflict started, he couldn't be sure that there were more than 5,000 properly equipped, trained soldiers in the Ukrainian army. The equipment is an issue. Again, it comes back to the quite horrific corruption of the previous regime. And by the way, I visited the palace of President Yanukovych, which is well worth a visit if you're ever in Kiev. It's quite the most ridiculous place I think I've ever been, with gold taps, gold toilets. It's ludicrous amount of wealth spent on largely poor taste furniture and fittings. But anyway, the point is that the money that should have gone to supply the army has been spent on that kind of thing over the previous few years. And so you have organisations, we visited one called Army SOS, which actually has a warehouse full of equipment that may or may not be useful to those going to fight out in the east. You'll just see random things there that have been donated by the public. Camouflage, fatigues, helmets, but also just things like socks and vests. Anything at all. People are giving anything they think could help. Another example is medical supplies. Those with a military background or a medical background will know about the golden hour, which is now becoming the platinum 10 minutes. This is the time when, if you're injured in the field, it's absolutely essential to get you some medical care. Those injuries that are not treated within the first hour are usually those that are most deadly. An NGO, a non-governmental organisation in Ukraine, is actually giving free improvised first aid kits, sending them out to the east. Again, this is non-official. In fact, the diaspora of Ukrainians has been very important. These are 2 Canadians who are originally from Ukraine, and they have been putting their own money, time and effort into getting these essential supplies out to those who are fighting. And the final example is accommodation. We were going to film in a hotel in Lviv where the owner had been accommodating refugees from the east and feeding. Unfortunately, we had to call off that piece of filming because on the day that we were going to film, he called us up to say that he could no longer afford to feed these people anymore. He was still accommodating them, but he couldn't afford to feed them anymore. So it's really getting to that point where people are stretching themselves to the limit of what they can offer. And the big question with this help that's been given is how long can that spirit last? And it's a question that nobody can really answer because we don't know how long this will go on. We don't know how much the government will be able to step into the gap. Crimea, I have to say that the worst stories we heard whilst we were in Ukraine were concerning Crimea. Crimea has kind of fallen off of the media landscape slightly, but in terms of what's happening there, it really should be going much higher. I'll give you a couple of stories that we heard. One was, this was a man who wasn't really an activist. In fact, he worked in the area of ecology, so you can't really call it a major political area. However, he didn't agree with some of the proposals of the previous Yanukovych government, particularly in relation to some of the natural areas around Crimea. As soon as Crimea was occupied, he was told by somebody who was in the secret services and who had been a school friend of his that they were coming for him, and he had 40 minutes to get out with his son. This is a guy I interviewed in Kiev who literally left his homeland in the space of 40 minutes. Second story was of a Crimean Tatar woman who had a 6-year-old son in school in Crimea. She noticed that things weren't getting any better, that the promised protection for Tatars hadn't materialized, but I said to her, when did you actually decide it was time to leave? And she said, when a man put a pistol to the head of my 6-year-old son and said, why are you still here? These kind of stories abound, particularly amongst the Crimean Tatars. And this, I don't think, will stop anytime soon. The impression that we got was that the Russians feel there are too many people in Crimea. It's obviously very important militarily, but the figures that we were told was that only about 300,000 people are needed to service military in Crimea. Its occupation is 2 million. The ways to get people out include the methods that I was just mentioning. And in fact, there have already been 2 waves of people leaving the West. The East in Crimea. The first wave was in March, obviously, during the occupation. The second wave was at the start of the school year in September, when again a lot of parents looked at the curriculum, saw that it was largely very pro-Russian. Russian language was obviously far more important than it had been, and people left then. The next expected wave is in January, when a raft of legislation, including on nationality and passports, is due to come into force. In terms of the atmosphere within Crimea, what we were told was that I spoke to people who'd lived through the Soviet era in Ukraine, and they said it was much worse than that. It was actually Stalinist. And they gave a couple of examples. Apparently, there are some places in Crimea where the portrait of Stalin has started appearing. And also in Crimea, November the 7th, the Revolution Day, has been restored as a day of celebration. Crimea is certainly one to keep an eye on. So to finish, what next? Well, we were lucky enough to be in Kiev on the 1-year anniversary of the Maidan protests. There were far fewer people there, in the thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. And many of the people were there for different reasons. In fact, the main reason that people came 1 year on was to demand justice for those who had been killed in the first demonstrations. There was anger that nobody has been brought to book for the killings. Not a single sniper, nothing. Now, the government clearly, the new government, because the government came into force on that day, could clearly claim that until now, without a coalition government, it would have been very difficult to advance on this. But that option, that excuse is now finished, and I think the people have made very clear that they expect that now there's a government, there has to be some action. But on the wider front, what do people in Ukraine want? The impression that we got was that they were far more focused on the future of the country rather than on the East. The East, again, this is part of the Russian narrative that Ukraine is torn in two between the pro-Russian and the pro-Europeans. It's simply not true. The actual geographical area that is in conflict at the moment is very small, between 5 and 10%, depending on how you look at it, of the country. And indeed, the belief that they like to present that everybody from the East is pro-Russian and everybody from the West is pro-Europe, again, doesn't add up. I'll give you one example. The colonel who is the spokesperson for the Ukrainian army and gives an update pretty much every other day on what's happening in the East. In other words, he's the guy who tells you how well the Ukrainian army is fighting the rebels. He's from Donetsk, and so, there's clear mixing of the lines that the Russians like to present as being very rigid. So in terms of what the Ukrainians want, what they really want, and this was repeated to us again and again, is that there are two wars in Ukraine at the moment. There's the hot war in the east, but there's also the war on corruption. And it's the war on corruption that's actually the more important war long-term for the country. The war in the east, I think many feel, is a very winnable war. We saw in August that it was pretty close to being one-sided in terms of the movement of the Ukrainian forces in punishing the rebels, and then there was Russian reinforcements. We've seen something very similar in the last few weeks. I think Ukrainians in general feel that that war is winnable if the Russians will stop interfering. But the war against corruption is a far more ingrained war, a far more difficult war. Just one example, we're talking to people about how do you stop this corruption that has weakened the state and made it so vulnerable to the kind of thing that's happening in the East. And one person said, well, look, we have to stop people taking bribes, but we also have to stop people giving bribes. I heard of one example of a woman whose mother had cancer, and she had to bribe several $100s just to get her mother seen. She also had to pay for all the medication and all the bed, everything basically. So you have to change the culture, and only in that way will you make the country stronger. And that's not obviously going to happen overnight. But finally, the main question I asked was, well, what happens next? How long has this government got? And the answer that everybody gave was either 1 or 2 years. In other words, this isn't an open-ended new period. People have voted in this government with a clear expectation that in 1 to 2 years there is clear evidence that the country's on a new path. It's not an open-ended blank check. And then the next question is obviously, well, what happens if within 1 to 2 years nothing has changed? And the answer was very clear. We've shown that we can get rid of oligarchs. We've shown that we can get rid of governments. And if there's no change, we'll do it again. Thanks very much.